to thank you for joining us, Jim, and taking time from what is surely a busy time for you nowadays, isn't it?
Yeah, we are certainly seeing business booming for better and for worse.
Mostly for better, I suppose, I hope.
Better for me. It's worse in that people are really tuning into the effects of climate change and the financial impacts that it's having on their businesses. And one of the reasons that they're tuning in so much is that there are increasing damages. As you and I are talking right now, there are multiple wildfires in California that have really caused a tremendous amount of damage, record financial losses and record loss of human life, and it all just happened overnight, seemingly. And it's those kinds of events that companies are really wondering, how much is this costing me, really? And is there a way to predict this? And is there a way to budget for it? Is there a way to understand these risks and manage them and mitigate them? So in that sense, it's unfortunate that my business is booming because it means that people are losing a lot of money and lives.
Yep, that is so. That is so. If you can offer, please, or just explain briefly what the business is. What is it that you do? We're saying off camera that I find you're offering particularly comprehensive in terms of the advisory that you offer and the solutions that you bring to the table of a company. So, please.
Well, I mean, we answer for corporations and for investors a pretty simple question, which is just, how much is climate change costing me? We try and help them put a price on climate change. And in order to do that, we use some pretty sophisticated big data and analytics and econometric models. But then what comes out is, what are the impacts, not just of my company on the climate, but of the climate on my company? What are the financial impacts of drought, wildfire, flooding, temperature extremes, those acute and chronic physical risks, as well as non-physical risks such as carbon pricing, climate-related litigation, climate-related reputation, and very importantly, opportunities such as energy efficiency, water materials use efficiency, energy stability, renewable energy use. Those kinds of financial opportunities. We quantify all of those and turn them around in an analytics package that's easy for people to understand and use, and it gives you a financial picture so that it's decision-relevant information.
Now, that brings us to the main subject I wanted to ask you about, which is, the management of climate risk in a company, right? And so, when we kind of step back and look at risk management in general at a company, it basically usually comes down to about four things, right? So you have financial risk, where they look at investment portfolios and cash flows and currency management and so forth, and maybe interest rate spreads and that kind of like financial risk. You have market risk, which is looking at technology innovation, anything that might disrupt their business from a marketplace perspective, like competition or new technologies or and so forth, even labor market transitions that might be happening. There's political risk, right? So especially companies that have a broad supply chain or that have operations in many countries. And then you have reputation risk, quality, media exposure. In these days when consumers are able to publish their own reviews and their own stories about a brand, that reputation risk can get particularly touchy. So, generally in every company, there's somebody in charge of all of the above, or like I said, the PR person is in charge of reputation, and the HR department is in charge of labor risks, and then you have the marketing department in charge of, and then you have the financial guys in charge of financial risks, and you have, so that's kind of spread out. And so along comes climate change, right? And kind of introduces what seems to be a new risk category in that milieu, in that boardroom, where they have to now look at something else. And climate, as you have expressed in various webinars and forums that I've seen you speak, it's complex, right? So it varies by asset, by hazard, by location. It varies by time. It can get pretty complex to manage that climate risk. And so my first question to you, given that preamble, is who have you seen at companies who usually handles climate? Do you see a gap in that skill set? Is there nobody yet quite being hired just to focus on that climate risk, just like we have financial risk managers and market risk managers and so forth? Is that a position just waiting to become a new field, like climate risk managers? And what are you seeing in terms of how companies are handling this from a personnel and executive perspective?
Yeah. Well, let me first say that the way it is now is maybe not the way it will be in the future, hopefully the near future. The way it is now, there's a lot of this activity going on, but it's not called climate change adaptation. So it might be called, as you pointed out, HR or PR, or it might be called capital allocation management, or risk management in the insurance, in the sense of buying insurance, or just simply engineering. So there's a lot of what we call hidden adaptation going on now. I think it's important to acknowledge that. So with that happening now, that your question is very valid. How do you get this sort of broad impact down into the mainstream of the business? Because it touches so many different business functions. One could even say all of the business functions. And I think the way I see things now is that often the sustainability person, or the ESG, environmental social governance person, or function, is coordinating the mainstreaming of this kind of information into the business processes. So often my first contact will be with a sustainability person, and they often already will have a council that's cross-functional and can tap their risk management person for the insurance questions, and their due diligence person for the mergers and acquisitions, etc. So I think that that's a great way to start. And yet the sustainability people I hear talking about mainstreaming, and what they mean by that is it would be great. They don't own the budget. They're not a profit center. They're a cost center. So trying to get the environmental, social, and governance decisions mainstreamed into the business processes is a key focus. Last thing I'll say about this, which is super important to me personally, is once you can quantify these impacts in dollars, risks and opportunities in dollars, that begins to be the universal language that everybody speaks. If you're talking about what's the right thing to do and what's going to be good for the corporate reputation, well, risk managers don't really, that's not their thing. They buy insurance. But once you start talking dollars, the conversations shift, and that mainstreaming becomes much easier. It's no longer an environmental discussion. It's just simply a business decision.
Yeah, I did notice on your website, it's interesting to that point, that you offered to identify a champion within a company and then have that champion use you as the source of information, the source of data, so you supply the information that champion within the company uses to then get the attention of the board, get the attention of the senior executives, to make decisions related to their resilience. And so But I just kind of loop back to the whole notion that if that is a need, if the company needs, or if that champion needs, to have this data and this support to get the attention of folks, it means, on the one hand, they don't have the attention of the folks yet. It takes the data, it takes the quantification of the risk of the potential dangers or recent losses, perhaps, to alert them to, and so it kind of comes back to the whole point of, well, perhaps we do need in the corporate world a higher level standing of climate resilience that is not there yet. Is that an accurate?
Here's another thing I just want to jump in on. You're really provoking a great discussion here because this past summer, in 2018, Standard & Poor's S&P Global released a study talking about how CEOs and CFOs are reporting already impacts to their earnings from weather and climate. And the impacts were on the order of 6% when they actually quantified them. They had a range, of course, but that's beginning to be material. Why do I bring that up? Because those are CFOs and CEOs who are actually on the line and and actually accountable to their shareholders for this earnings impact. So there's a very big opportunity, I think, we have to escalate. Who has a breadth of visibility over the organization? Well, sustainability has that breadth of visibility, but the CEOs and CFOs are the ones that have not only the visibility, but the accountability across the entire organization. And they are, some of them, taking notice of the impacts. If you think about it, sustainability professionals have a view to the entire organization, but the CEOs and the CFOs not only have the view to the entire organization, but also the accountability for the entire organization. So that is very important for us because we should be able to help them understand in financial terms what the impacts of weather and climate are now and into the near future, so that they can make better informed decisions. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures also recommends that not only do we invoke the management level and that the governance is strong, but also that the board has visibility to the risks and opportunities posed by climate change. And I think that when we see the top-down pressure, as well as bottom-up accountability, that's when we start really seeing the needle move quickly.
Which is, I guess if we can just step back a bit and sort of look at a bigger picture of more of the other influences that C-level executives respond to, right? And so, we can look at regulation, we could look at public pressures, we could look at disclosure pressures, we could look at the disaster events themselves and how that is creating more urgency and sort of calling their attention a bit more. How do you see that kind of bigger picture in terms of how do we get corporations? When we say corporations, I mean, we're thinking immediately of the Fortune 500, the Forbes 2000, the ones with the large footprints and global supply chains, but they're also like local leaders, and the bulk of an economy at a city level is small and mid-sized businesses, right? And so when we think of business in general, how do you see the maturity or this transition as we see C-level executives paying more attention, taking this more seriously, kind of responding to those signals, to those pressures? So you put yourself in their shoes. What do you look at? What do you expect that they will be looking at more so moving forward, so we can get more action on the corporate front?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you've described it really quite well already. For publicly traded companies, they are very highly attuned to the needs and demands of shareholders, particularly large institutional investors, who are already asking them for better disclosure of climate risks. As a matter of fact, $100 trillion of assets under management in firms like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street have signed on to this disclosure framework, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And that does drive a tremendous pressure, because not only are they sort of being asked by their shareholders, which is important, but also it's an awareness building thing. I mean, there's a CEO has lots to think about, and climate change is maybe not on their forefront until it is, and it can become on their front burner through some of the things that you mentioned. Certainly, shareholder pressure is one of them, but we shouldn't neglect things like, well, for example, everybody in California right now is acutely aware of the drought and then the wildfires that were provoked by the drought. And there's a lot of discussion in the public sphere about the effects of climate change and how it's caused these tremendously damaging wildfires. I would imagine that almost everyone in California has either smelled the smoke or known someone that's been affected by those fires. So it's very top of mind. And it's those kinds of effects that make people, CEOs and CFOs are people, after all, and they're affected just like the rest of us by lived personal experience. So the more we realize that we're living climate impacts now, I think the faster the change will be.
Yeah, we don't, as you say, I mean, it's not something that's not really the way we would like for them to awaken to this, by getting hit by a disaster. But
science is boring, and but when you really, when you or your loved ones or your family or your friends is actually affected by one of these disasters, you kind of do have to ask yourself, was this weather? Was this a one-off event? Or was this a recurring issue?
And in fact, I think the reporting on the most part treats climate impacts as one-offs. They're not really set up to expect future events or worsening of climate impacts. And so from a disclosure and financial reporting perspective, that's been a drag against progress for a while. From an accounting perspective, it's always like this, just a non-recurring expense or a non-recurring event. And the way it's shaping up, it's becoming absolutely recurring. So that's another one of those factors that'll move that needle and get people a lot more aware. Absolutely. Now, in terms of a global perspective, we'll just wrap it up with this dimension. I mean, most of what is done in the analytics and modeling world tends to be concentrated, and correct me if I'm wrong, but tends to be concentrated first on publicly traded larger companies, and mostly in developed societies where most of these companies are based. And yet, when we look at climate change and the impacts it has and it's been having and will have ever more, since the bulk of the population is in less developed countries in China and India, how do you see your field evolving in those locations, and having companies that are dominant in those locations adopt a service like yours and become more aware and take action and quantify the risks and so forth and respond to that?
Well, let me tell you a story. I went to a national adaptation forum several years ago, and I was expecting to find the latest and greatest thinking on how we're going to adapt to the impacts that we're starting to see. And I came away a little bit horrified because the way we were approaching adaptation, and still are, doesn't scale. We're throwing consultants and PhDs at every single problem, and there aren't enough PhDs and experts in the world to go around. We have to be able to scale up our adaptation response much, much faster. This is why we built a software tool to do it. We have to use the power of technology to dramatically increase the speed at which we can screen our assets and dramatically reduce the cost over time of doing that. So while we, in my case, my firm actually focuses on investors and multinational corporations, large real estate portfolios, that sort of thing. The goal is to be able to refine this technology to where eventually it can become accessible to the developing world, who will never be able to hire an expensive consultant to tell it, where are my risks and what do I need to do about them? We have to use the power of technology, and I'm a huge believer in that.
And the way, again, to make that available or accessible to companies in those locations that are pretty, I mean, physically and in other ways removed from where most of the action is taking place, would be how? I mean, how can we get, those enterprises and those companies, especially in countries like China and India that are complicated, they're difficult to get to and to penetrate. Africa is expected to multiply its population tremendously in the next 30 to 40 years. A big chunk of the increase to 9-10 billion people will happen in Africa, and that is a splintered kind of environment. It's a big concern. I mean, not just most of the damage will take place there, but those business communities are really a lot less concentrated than ours is. So over here in America, let's say, with 50, 60, maybe 100 companies, you cover a lot of ground if companies really get with it. In those markets, part of the challenge of scaling is just, the dispersion of the business community. Any thoughts, any ideas? I mean, this is so new, right? This is so, hitting us right now. But we gotta start thinking about this.
Again, I'm continue to be a huge believer in the power of technology to change the game. We see it over and over again, how technology comes in and it dramatically lowers costs and it dramatically increases the reach and the ability to reach out in low cost. So I don't have to go to China or Africa in your two examples, but our highly sophisticated, system can reach them through phone line or cell phone.
That is true. That is true. That is true. So hopefully you will, and you will have even more growth than you've had so far, and really spawn, a multiplication of services that bring the corporate world on board, because God knows it has to happen. So thank you very much, Jim, for being with us. It's been an education.
Thank you, Alex, for having me. It's a great pleasure.